Welcome, everybody. As Marcy said, I'm Jessica Ryan, for those of you that don't know me, and I'm this year's spokesperson for the League of Women Voters. And as such, I'd like to welcome everyone to our annual opening meeting. Before we begin, I'm sure I don't need to tell this to all of you, but for anyone else who's new to the League, I just want to mention, if you're not aware of the League's work, we're a nonpartisan political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government, working to increase understanding of major public policy issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. If you'd like to know more about the amazing work the League has accomplished over its 100-year history, both locally and nationally, please go visit our website at LWVAmherst.org. We're always looking for new members to help share the work, so please consider joining us if you're not already a member. So tonight, we are thrilled to have our own member, Sudha Setty, Dean and Law Professor of Western New England University, give our opening lecture of the season. The title of her talk is Democracy and the Rule of Law, the Challenge of Restoring Faith in U.S. Institutions. How lucky are we to have an expert talk to us about this crucial topic at this moment when our democracy is being severely tested and challenged. Sudha's accomplishments are miles long, so I will be necessarily brief and just cite some of her bio. She became Dean of Western New England University School of Law in 2018 and has been on the faculty since 2006. She's taught courses in constitutional law, law on terrorism, national security and government accountability, contracts, and business organizations. Her scholarly work focuses on comparative analysis of separations of power, rule of law, and national security. Her resume is long and deep, and I encourage our members to avail themselves of her many books, book chapters, and articles, too many to list or do justice in this brief intro. Additionally, Sudha joined the Amherst League of Women Voters in 2015, getting her start, as many of us do, working in the annual book sale, which hopefully will come back next summer. She's now also a member of the Racial Justice Committee. In an e-bulletin interview a couple of years back, she stated that she found Amherst to be a very engaged community, saying, quote, "It's nice to be part of an organization that engages and harnesses that energy." So let us take this opportunity tonight, through Sudha's generous acceptance of our invitation to give this talk, to renew all of our efforts to engage and harness our collective energy. Welcome to opening meeting 2021. And with that, I'll hand things off to Sudha.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that kind introduction. And it's so great to see so many familiar faces here. We were saying before this got started that it's not quite being in person, but it is still lovely to see everyone and to be able to have a conversation this evening. So I also want to thank Marcy Sklo for facilitating this event. And I also just want to take a minute to reflect on what a generous invitation this was to come speak at opening meeting. I've always found this to be such a special event, highlighting a key issue that the League feels as a priority, not only in our community, but beyond each year. And in the past year, I have really enjoyed the conversations about voting rights or immigrant and refugee rights or any number of important and compelling issues. And so I'm really hopeful that folks will take advantage of this conversation and even this format to ask questions and make this more conversational than a lecture. I genuinely invite you to do that. So Jessica mentioned that the title of this talk is about restoring and restoring faith in the rule of law and democracy. And so I think we could talk for a very long time about that topic. Frankly, a short conversation is probably not enough, but I do want to highlight 4 different themes as we work through this. And then I do invite conversation as we go through it or even afterwards, whatever feels comfortable to folks. So the 4 things I want to make sure that we talk about are, first, what is the rule of law and what is its relationship to democracy? Second, to maybe reflect for a minute on how the rule of law has been strained or compromised in recent years. Third, what steps are occurring now that are meant to restore some confidence in democratic norms and values and in the rule of law? And fourth, this kind of open question about how we should view the next couple of years. Is it with optimism? Is it with continued kind of, I think, concern that a lot of people have in terms of where the conversation in our country is headed? What should our outlook be with regard to that? So first, I want to start off with a conversation about the rule of law, which is a kind of slippery concept in its definition, but it always has a few fundamental characteristics that underpin it. One is this notion that there are limits on what the government can do, right? That it is a grant of power to the government from people who are governed, and again, that there are some limits and constraints on that power. The second is that people in government and government institutions themselves can be held accountable for transgressions of those constraints. And then the third is that there is transparency in what the government does, that there are disclosures and there are mechanisms and ways in which we, the people who are governed, can understand what the government is doing in our name and what government actors are doing. And you can see these principles as how they relate directly to the idea of how a liberal democracy ought to work, right? We vote based on our understanding of what government is doing and what government actors are doing. We rely on a smooth transfer of power once we vote as part of kind of our democratic institutions and processes. We elect officials and members of government to enact and enforce the laws that are there on the books that are supposed to be publicly available so that we know what that law is. And in terms of government accountability, we have mechanisms like investigations or impeachment or lawsuits or criminal actions, or even just the day-to-day operation under our separation of powers, to help us hold accountable the people who are in power. And if all of those things kind of fail in the process, we have this ultimate idea in a democracy that the vote, that the ballot box is a form of accountability that we can all exercise. So beyond the part of the rule of law that relates to kind of the processes, accountability, the transparency, the processes of law, there's another kind of thicker view of what the rule of law is that includes consideration of additional factors that relate to the substance of the law. And these are part of the democratic values of our society too. So under a thicker conception of the rule of law, we're talking about things like equal protection and expanding and protecting rights for historically excluded or marginalized populations, or protecting individual rights against government infringement. And the US system of government places a lot of value on both of these, right? The process piece and then also the substantive piece. And just to kind of illustrate this more clearly, I want us to think of the original version of the US Constitution, something that really focuses on transparency and allocation of power, right? What does the president get to do? What does Congress get to do? We have a court, what does that get to do? And theoretically, we can see how this is a rule of law-based government, right? It lays out the powers of government. It tells us how they're limited. It has a process for electing people and holding them accountable. So it has all those pieces, those kind of fundamental parts of the rule of law. But if we think about this second piece, like equal protection and substantive fairness, right? That's not there in large part in our Constitution. We do have a Bill of Rights that's there. But if we think even about the work and the mission and the founding of the League of Women Voters, right? There's no suffrage for women at the time that that Constitution is founded. And so technically it comports with the rule of law, right? You see the laws, they're on paper, you know what the limits of government are, but it's a government that is set up that intentionally and structurally excludes more than 50% of the population, way more than 50% if you include gender and include non-landholding men and include people of color and include all the categories who don't have access to that power. So again, two different aspects, one having to do with processes and one having to do with equal rights. And theoretically, at least, we have a strong commitment in the US to both of those. So it's important for us to think about what it is that we're trying to achieve or what it is that we think we've lost when we're talking about the rule of law and democratic norms. And so that's why I start with these two pieces as kind of our starting point. So if we think about this, right, the process part and the substance part, what's been lost in the last several years? And this again is a lengthy conversation that could kind of take up a lot of time for us. But I think we can all point to, if we think to ourselves and what has been lost in terms of these two concepts in the last few years, we probably all come up with some different answers, but we probably all have some pieces that are in common, right? This idea of a lack of accountability for some of the actions that were taken by the federal government in particular for rule breaking and the rule breaking that occurred there and the lack of accountability. So we've gotten, ethics violations or potential violations of the emoluments clause of the Constitution that relates to receiving gifts or favors from foreign countries, conflicts of interests, the refusal to disclose documents, a lack of willingness to accept democratic processes like the outcome of votes, lack of transparency about the use of power. As Jessica mentioned, my area is in the field of national security, and there was a lot more secrecy around that type of decision-making in the Trump administration than we had seen previously, but also in lots of other areas of decision-making. And then also the kind of breaking of traditions and norms that had to do with how processes work, right? How it is that the executive branch turns over information to Congress when they're asking for it, or how it is that they even interact with different state and federal agencies, or even just attacking the press and claiming the need to declare certain entities that are focused on holding government accountable, like declaring them as enemies of the state, right? These are all kind of norm breaking or norm violating actions that the government has taken. And that's just with the process piece of it. When we think about the substance of laws and how those were affected over the last few years, there are so many things, right? We can think about the treatment of immigrants and refugees. We can think about the treatment of religious and racial minorities within the United States, the rollback of protections for, Title IX on college campuses, the rollback of the enforcement of civil rights laws, the kind of encouragement to undermine voting rights and to kind of cut away from lots of other aspects of individual rights and expression, including freedom of the press, which I had alluded to earlier. So we are all aware of that, right? And I think if I asked everyone who's here on Zoom and everyone who's watching elsewhere to come up with an additional 5 things that you're aware of, probably you could do that pretty easily. This has been, that's the reason that this is the focus of tonight's conversation, is because it has been a profound and cumulative stretching of norms, breaking of norms, and testing to see whether the guardrails that are up to kind of keep our government constrained and accountable, whether those actually work. And I think, there's a sense of mixed opinion on whether they did actually work, right? On the one hand, we are living in 2021 with a different administration in power. We have a change of power that did occur. It was not quite peaceful, but eventually we got there. We have the system and process of lawmaking that is generally on track. But on the other hand, I think many of us feel like we have lost a lot, and that there is a sense that the norms that were in place 5 years ago or 6 years ago, that there perhaps should not be an assumption that they will just restore themselves, but more needs to be done in that vein. So that brings me to my third point, right? What steps are going on now? What's being done in order to try to restore the rule of law, restore norms, and arguably and hopefully restore a sense of faith in these institutions of government, and underlying that, restoring faith in the way that democracy operates in general. So I think there's a few things we can think about here. Every day, I feel like we see news about laws that are meant to address substantive issues, right? We know that there are laws that Congress is considering with regard to voting rights. We know that there are laws that deal with reproductive rights, laws that deal with any number of individual rights issues to try to be more protective of that relationship between individuals and the government. In terms of the actual piece, there's a lot of work that the Congress is trying to do there too. So there are many kind of bills being proposed that are meant to kind of codify pre-president norms that were in place before President Trump, or even recognizing that those norms weren't that strong even in the pre-Trump era, and that more work needs to be done in order to kind of shore them up and make sure that we're not running afoul of what we thought were understood norms of how government works. So, a raft of proposed legislation to curb presidential power. Some proposals are substantive, again, things like trying to curb the president's power to declare a national emergency, which every time that happens, the president kind of accrues more power and decision-making authority. Bills that are meant to constrain the president's national security powers. And this is something that has been an effort for the last 20 years. And so it's gone through numerous presidencies, but it seems that perhaps there's more traction in these efforts at this point than there would have been 10 years ago to do this work. And then I think a raft of legislation that has to deal with things that were either norms or poorly, not really enforceable aspects of the way government operated. And just a few of these things like limiting the pardon power when there's a situation where there might be corruption that's involved, or prohibiting self-pardons, tolling the statute of limitations so that a president, when he or she is in office, cannot say, oh, well, you've run out of time to sue me on this, but allowing for the clock to start running again only after they get out of office. Something that clarifies what emoluments are, so that and gives the Congress the power to sue the president if those parameters are being violated. Limiting the ability of the president to use funds in ways that were different than how Congress appropriated money to the executive branch to use. Protecting whistleblowers and inspectors general, and trying to restore some ability for those individuals to do their work without perhaps fearing retaliation. Shoring up the ethics standards that come in the Hatch Act, and actually putting some teeth behind the ability to use the Hatch Act to stop violations from occurring. Some of you may remember quite famously former advisor to President Trump, Kellyanne Conway, being found to have violated the Hatch Act numerous times. And her response, and President Trump's response at the time, was, well, oh, well, what are you going to do about it? And the answer was nothing, right? So proposed legislation so that some consequence actually occurs when a violation has occurred. Proposals to shore up how presidential transitions work, or the certification of electoral votes. Creating better tax transparency for the president and vice president. And a big one that I think, all of these are reactive to the President Trump's actions and choices while he was in office. But a big one is, how do you create laws that help prevent foreign interference with election, right? So all of these things are in process. They are not perfect laws. It's unclear whether they will pass, but it's heartening to see that they are being introduced, they are being taken seriously, and they're being debated. So we have that set of legislation that's trying to shore up the idea that Congress plays a role in setting parameters around what the government can do. I think we also see, in terms of norms restoration, obviously, and for some of us, a kind of, in a sense of relief, a return to some aspects of normalcy that every president prior to President Trump had adhered to, at least in a larger part than what he did. And by this, I mean things like the norms of decorum that the president uses, or the ways in which the president chooses to engage with the press. I think those of us who spend a lot of time looking at what presidents do, it's never satisfying. Presidents never give enough answers to the press, and that's true whether they're Democrats or Republicans. But I think President Trump was an outlier in that regard. And so seeing some sense of a restoration to perhaps an imperfect norm, but something that's better, we see in the Biden administration. I think there are other things like reliance on expertise. And this seems kind of obvious, but this was a big problem during the Trump administration. That was an administration that came in promising to reduce the number of government jobs, right? This was part of the kind of drain the swamp rhetoric that came out in 2015 through maybe 2017 or 18, where he made a promise that for every job that he was created in government, that 2 would be eliminated. essentially what that did is eliminate expertise from lots of departments of government that relied on it. And that's everything from the State Department, where you need experts on certain countries, sometimes decades long study and work in these countries to help inform the US on its foreign policy decisions, to the people who work in fish and wildlife, who understand a particular region's ecosystem really well. Those jobs were either eliminated or the folks were driven out because political appointees were put in place who did not have a lot of expertise in that field. A lot of that is getting restored. It's a hard job. It will take President Biden and his administration a lot of time to do this, because by some accounts, departments like the Department of State lost up to a third of its subject matter experts in some regions, and those folks don't come back easily, and it's not easy to find people with equivalent expertise. So, but he's trying, right? And we can see the government trying to restore this notion of reliance on expertise. So another important norm that is kind of coming back into government. And I think if you talk to people who work for various parts of the federal government that did not feel like they were kind of in the political crossfire previously, there's a sense of relief and an expectation that they can keep doing this work now, right? That they will not be kind of under fire for kind of just going about their normal job in a way that they had been under the previous administration. So I think that tells us that there are two things happening, right? There's a sense from the public and from Congress that more needs to be done to put into place these guardrails to prevent against other similar norm breaking or law breaking activity by a president. But there's also things that need to be done even within government to kind of restore institutions and restore their ability for them to do their work. And then the last piece that I want to talk about here is looking at this. Should we have cause for optimism? How should we be thinking about this? And I'll tell you that I have mixed feelings on this, right? Like many of you, I feel like there was a series of really shocking things that occurred over the course of the last 5 years. Perhaps the kind of rioting of the Capitol building on January 6th being kind of a visually shocking, culminating event in some respects that had occurred. And it's hard to see at that moment, right, how it is that you should feel optimistic about the next phase going forward. But I do think there's some reasons for us to feel good about what we are, the moment that we're in and what we can see ahead of us. So the moment that we're in, again, I think it's the reasons that I articulated a minute ago, that we do see not only government actors, but the public, right? Civil society organizations, nonprofits, task forces and committees, groups that are people who are working together to make substantive change in directions, partly in reaction to the aspects of the Trump administration that they felt like were overreaching in a lot of ways, undermining democratic institutions and undermining the rule of law. So all of this work is continuing on. We should feel good about that. The government itself is investing time and energy. Congress is doing this, and the executive branch is doing this in order to try to restore some of those values and restore all of our faith in these institutions. And then finally, I just want to say, that in some senses, the Trump administration was extraordinary. In some ways, it was not extraordinary at all, right? In some ways, it was a president exercising the maximum amount of power that he could under the system that exists at the time. And we've seen that before, right? That is not an entirely new thing. Certainly, we can think about this moment that we're in some ways being similar to a post-Watergate moment, where we see excess of power being exercised by a president, law breaking, the violation of norms and rules occurring, and that there is an opportunity in that moment for conversation, for advocacy, for activism, for legal action, for all the pieces to come together to really effectuate change. Now, if we look at those post-Watergate changes, they are not perfect, right? They did not solve all of our problems for all time. But what they did is they put a marker in place about limited government, about oversight, about the importance of preserving individual rights in the face of an overreaching president. And there's an opportunity to do that again, right? To kind of make sure that as we go through this process, we're trying to improve these processes, safeguard the things that we think are important, and in doing so, also making room for improvements in substantive laws like voting rights, like speech rights, like all these other aspects of allowing individual freedom and constraining the ability of the government to penalize or criminalize our behavior. So in terms of that, I do have a bit of optimism, right? I think that we are moving in a direction that's good, and that if sustained, right, and that's a big if, that there's a lot of momentum behind making changes that can, frankly, benefit all of us, not just in this kind of moment after one perhaps your administration has been in power, but for the long haul, right? That part I am optimistic about. I do hope that we keep momentum going in this regard. Oftentimes it's easy when something is a little bit in the rearview mirror to just kind of be relieved and say, okay, we've taken care of it. But certain issues that have come to the fore in the last couple of years, and I'm thinking particularly about racial justice and larger social justice issues, these did not start in 2015 or 2016, right? These are longstanding issues that have needed to be addressed, and there is now momentum and energy behind them. And for that, I think we can look as one of the silver linings that activism really has increased, and the level of engagement and advocacy around important issues has increased significantly, and hopefully will be sustained. So with that, I'll stop now, and happy to have a conversation about whatever people would like to talk about.
Thank you so much, Sudha. This is perfect. And I'm hoping people will have questions or comments, and will certainly either use the reaction button to raise your hand and speak yourself, or put it in the chat. Yeah, go ahead, Till.
Yes, hi. Nice to see you again. We have a country that in some ways is not democratic. It's ruled by a minority of the Electoral College, the Trump election. And then you have the combination, the malapportioned Senate combined with the filibuster. Is it a democracy?
Yeah, so Till, I know you're asking a loaded question, but I'll try my best here. So we do not have a direct democracy, right? We all know that even with our federal elections in particular, as Till pointed out, we have an electoral college, right, that is a representative voting system that is not entirely democratic. We have the Senate, which is provides a great deal of power to states that do not have a significant population in them. And we have other barriers to voting exist that prevent people from exercising the franchise. So those are all non-democratic things. I will say this, right? The Constitution is a compromise document at its core, and has so many pieces in it that represent less than democracy in the way that they're articulated. The Electoral College is one of them. The way the Senate is structured is certainly one. Again, disenfranchisement of a huge swath of the population, saying that they are not eligible to vote at all, or have representation, that is baked into our Constitution. It is a highly flawed document. It has a lot of great parts to it, but certainly this piece about democracy is not fulfilled in that document. So I think the question then is, given the fact that we live in what best can be called an imperfect democracy, how do we try to do better, right? And that's hard, right? Amending the Constitution is not an easy thing, and you would need that to get rid of the Electoral College. I find it hard to believe that you're going to find a sufficient number of states that are willing to give up their outsized power in the Senate or in the Electoral College. So as long as we have this Constitution, this is the arrangement that we're stuck with. I do think that one aspect of what Till is talking about with the kind of undermining of voting rights that's occurred, not just in the last few years, but in starting, I would say, in the like 2009, 2010 timeframe, when things like the Voting Rights Act started to get undercut by the Supreme Court. Since then, you've seen a kind of rapid set of changes that have occurred that are really regressive and are really meant to make it harder for people to vote. And that part is disheartening for a number of reasons. One is that if the core of democracy is this idea that we are representing the people, then you need the people to vote, right? You want to encourage voting, make it as easy as possible, and not put up barriers to that. But the second is a thing that I know that many of us are aware of and have been thinking about. It's not just random who is limited in the way in which obstacles are brought up to vote, right? It is meant either explicitly to disenfranchise voters who tend to vote Democrat, or sometimes less explicitly but clearly meant to make it more difficult for people of lower socioeconomic means, historically excluded populations based on racial groups, lots of other people who have fought and struggled for the right to vote are the ones who are kind of at the most precarious position of having the vote taken away. And that part continues to make it difficult to believe in this notion of democracy. And yet, this is what we have, right? And so in a certain sense, I hope that what we have is still good enough for us to, again, mobilize, advocate, and encourage people to go out and vote, because that's the only way that these laws will ever change, is to change who's in government. It seems more likely that we would be able to do that than to change the Constitution wholesale to make it a more democratic document. And the last thing I'll say on this is that, honestly, there is such a thing as too much democracy, right? I have watched the California gubernatorial recall with a sense of somewhat of dread, because the way that government is set up is for direct democracy constantly, right? They amend their constitution through public referendum. They are able to depose or remove their governor very easily through this recall process that requires a ton of money and effort to defend against. That's a lot of democracy. I'm not sure that we would all think that that's the best way to structure government or the way that transitions occur. But so it's not to say that there's one ideal example of, like, if everything were more democratic, it would be perfect. It's just to suggest that democracy is complicated.
Thank you.
That's great. Someone else?
Well, if no one's asking, I do have another question. You mentioned it already, the pardon power. It seems to me that that's a loaded gun sitting in the Constitution. Or you put that in combination with the unlikelihood of impeachment and removal, given the way this anti-democratic setup that we have, and the pardon power. I mean, that is an invitation for disaster. And I'm not quite sure that the recommendations that are being made about sort of reining in the pardon power really quite get to the threat that power has.
I agree with you. I mean, I think that the current proposals are to, again, limit the pardon power so that if there's a matter of corruption, that there's you're not allowing a blanket pardon power. And also there are proposals to eliminate the option for self-pardon or pardon of the vice president, right? So that whatever else is done, you can't kind of self-pardon on your way out. And I mean, interestingly enough, those proposals themselves, they could refer to the Trump administration. They could refer to the George W. Bush administration, some of the pardons that were done right at the end of that administration, the Clinton administration, right, in terms of situations where there might have been some corruption or self-dealing that occurred there. And so I think there's an effort being made by the people who are putting forward these bills to just frame them in a way that might gain bipartisan support, to say this is not about any one president. This is about multiple presidents that we've seen even in the last few decades who have undermined the purpose of this pardon to begin with, which is that the pardon was there to exercise mercy, right? In situations where there had been grave injustice that's been done, not to kind of on your way out, kind of help all your friends out and then leave office, right? So I do think that that those efforts are limited intentionally in order to try to see if they can gain more support among people who might traditionally not be part of a coalition to rein in presidential power.
Thank you.
I wonder, Sudha, if you can speak to this idea, which seems like a dream at this point, of bipartisanship. Like, it just seems that everything that you're talking about has been quite purposeful, and for much longer than the average person. You know, it seems like everyone's just kind of waking up to what these darker forces that have been actively trying to undermine democracy, and now it seems to really have infected this ideal of bipartisanship, which seems like farther and farther away. And I don't know, maybe you can talk to that.
I think that that's fair. I do think that, you know, that there certainly you'll hear individual members of Congress lamenting a time when bipartisanship used to occur more frequently. And I think that that's probably true to a certain extent, but I think it's also, there's kind of a limited scope of that, right? In some senses, this idea of bipartisanship is something that when the Constitution was framed, there was a belief that there wouldn't be kind of a wholesale allegiance to party line, and therefore it would allow for this kind of bipartisanship to occur more frequently. I think, frankly, within 15 years of the Constitution being ratified, it was pretty clear that that wasn't working out, right? That there were serious problems with it. And I'm only saying that to just suggest that this is a long-standing problem. It is not a new problem. And if we think about this idea of Congress not being able to work together or not do a good job, I mean, I think that the critique is a fair one. I do think that our structure of government is intentionally set up to be very inefficient, and in order to kind of slow the process of change. And so some of that is by design. And I do think we can look back and see other times in which you do have a great deal of discord within Congress or within the federal government, right? The number of times over the course of American history when sedition charges, or, you know, the House Un-American Activities Committee or whatever else, these are weapons that have been used, right, to try to attack members of Congress when that create divisiveness that's extraordinary and extreme, and sometimes comes with criminal penalties to it. So I think a lot of that is not necessarily new, but it feels, I think, very pointed right now because of the moment we're in. I guess the other thing I would say about this is, you know, our Congress, and particularly the House of Representatives, has become much more diverse in who it represents. And by that, I mean in all different senses, right? There is much different, like, gender representation and racial representation than existed in that body 50 years ago. There are people who are from less wealthy backgrounds, right, who are able to run for Congress now in ways that perhaps were not available to them. And once you get a larger cross-section of people in government, the likelihood that not everyone is going to have the same perspective on things probably increases, right? That's not surprising, that different people's lived experiences and whatever their affiliations are is going to inform the way that they're thinking about things. I mean, I have wishful thinking about this. I wish that people were able to see past you know, their policy disagreements in one sphere to try to work together in another, and not politicize every piece of what's before Congress, you know, every budget measure, every time that the debt ceiling needs to be addressed, right? That it's not turning into some lengthy drama. But I don't know that it's wholesale different than what it used to be, given the changes in the country and the changes of who's in Congress.
But then maybe to take the opposite side, to say, like, what maybe bipartisanship is not an ideal, and maybe it might have been a preferable situation if the party who is ruling is able to actually do things, and then the people can decide whether or not they like those things. It seems like our system now is set up that the parties have to undermine each other and actually hurt each other and consequently hurt the country. It's a very negative feedback loop.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair too. I mean, if you kind of study world governments, right, you see that the ones that are most likely to last are the parliamentary ones, the ones that do exactly what you're talking about, Jessica, where they have the ability to kind of exercise power more efficiently and move forward. And in history, presidential governments are the ones that are more likely to fail, particularly because of the reasons that you're talking about. And I don't just mean fail like someone gets thrown out of office. I mean, the entire system collapses and needs to be rewritten. The US is actually quite an outlier, right, in terms of being an old and relatively successful government with this model. So I think you're exactly right that there's many different ways to look at that. Barbara, you've had your hand up for a while.
I read this book called The Politics Industry, and talking about how there are certain things that are so powerful that we see in our government now that are just not anywhere. I mean, they're just sort of, they become customary. So I'm thinking of the power in the Speaker of the House that's concentrated. So like they gave the example of the debt ceiling thing when they went forever and ever, the representatives would have voted to, raise the debt ceiling and open the government. But one speaker from a small state, who had a very small constituency, was able to say, no, we're not going to vote on it. And he kept it going and going and going. And so is there any way to get those things to change, since there's sort of no clear way how they got there?
Yeah, it's a fair question. So a lot of those conventions, right, they're exactly as you suggest. They're not written into some statute that says, here's the job of the Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leader or anyone else, right? These are conventions that have developed over time. Again, this goes to that where we started in this conversation, this notion of norms, right? These kind of unwritten or codified, these practices that have been codified over time, but they're not like hard barriers or hard constraints to power. So yeah, the short answer is that yes, if the House wanted to rewrite the rules to limit the amount of power that the Speaker of the House has, the House can actually go ahead and do that, right? They are a self-governed body to a certain extent and are able to figure that out. Similarly with the Senate, right? There are certain rules. This is why we see this debate about the filibuster all the time, right? That's not a law, that's a Senate convention that has developed over time and that people have adhered to. So any of those types of rules within a chamber of Congress can be changed in terms of the way they conduct their business. Again, I think it's hard to see the likelihood of that occurring because people who are in positions of power tend very often not to want to give that up.
Put it up, right.
Hold on to what they have.
So would it be easier if it were a matter of trying to pass a new law?
So that's an interesting question. So generally, the Congress has not wanted to pass laws, pass statutes about its own actions that are kind of fully confined within the business of Congress. They could try, but then basically the way that it works to pass a law, right? They would need to send that to the president, and what they'd be doing is signaling that he has a say in how they govern themselves in Congress. And so it seems less likely that they'd want to actually try to pass a law to put into place these how they conduct their business within the House or within the Senate.
Thank you.
Marla, did you want to ask a question?
Thanks. So Sudha, this is very interesting, and it got me thinking a little bit about the sort of movement towards alternatives to policing in the context of the rule of law, and just wondering if you could talk us through that a little bit. For these alternatives to be put in place and for there to be really effective change, are we going to have to see changes to laws on state and municipal levels concerning what is really an offense? And I'm thinking about different types of misdemeanors, traffic stops, things of that kind. Whatever insight you can give would be very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess the observation I make here is that you're right that it would be both a question of laws and a question of norms, right? So you would need changes in the laws, as you alluded to a couple of them in terms of what is considered criminal behavior, what's considered a felony, right? Those are largely state laws, and so the state legislature would need to change those pieces. But then the other aspect of thinking about alternatives to policing is really a cultural question, right? Where is it that we, what are the institutions in our local government or our state government that we trust to do the work of kind of community safety or community engagement? How is that power allocated? And that's both a question of lawmaking, right? If the Massachusetts state legislature wants to pass a law where it allocates way more money to specifically to community safety organizations, they can do that. That would be lawmaking. But also, I think there's a high level of cognizance that it has to be in conjunction with a cultural change and a norms change. You know, I've heard the Attorney General and Governor Baker talk at great length and really in an earnest fashion about the work of the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, right? This idea of a statewide commission that is just starting their work now to try to reimagine how it is that we train and work with police officers and community groups in order to have a different relationship between certain communities and law enforcement. That is not just lawmaking that's required, but it's norm changing and culture changing work that needs to occur over a much longer period of time. So I do think that there is a relationship there, although obviously in a very different context.
I wanted to ask you about what you think is going to happen. It looks like we're coming to some sort of crescendo about Roe versus Wade. And so if that gets overturned or the Texas statutes apply and it spreads, what is the recourse to that? What happens if we overturn that?
Yeah, that's a fair question, Cynthia. I mean, so this is, Roe versus Wade was a case that, in finding a constitutional right for reproductive choice, it essentially overturned a bunch of state laws that had criminalized abortion at the time, right? It invalidated those state laws. So if Roe versus Wade were to be overturned by the Supreme Court, you would go back to the situation that you had in 1973 before Roe was decided, which is a patchwork of state laws. It would be, I think, a very different landscape now in terms of which states allow for abortion and what the gestational period during which they would allow for abortion. And I think it would look very different in different places across the country. I imagine that there would be many more states now that would be have more permissive abortion rights laws on their state books than there were in 1973. But I do imagine that you would immediately have a bunch of states that criminalized abortion, whether it's in the way that Texas has with their law or in another manner.
Well, then do you have to start over if you want to put that back into the, our Constitution, our laws? Do you have to start the whole process over?
Well, it's a good question. So I think there are multiple avenues that people can take. One would be President Biden has been advocating, which is for kind of a national Roe versus Wade law, right? So this would not be something that the Supreme Court would necessarily strike down. In fact, it seems likely that the Supreme Court would not strike it down if it were put into place. That would guarantee something along the lines of what Roe versus Wade guaranteed, or maybe one of the later cases that came up protecting abortion rights. So that's one way to do it. That would need to get through Congress, right? And as we've talked about, it's not the most efficient process, but it might be the one that's available. The other avenue would be to challenge individual laws based on constitutional findings that have been made in the years since Roe versus Wade. So for example, you know, Roe versus Wade has been in place for almost 50 years. And since then, the court has recognized time and again a much broader swath of privacy rights and personal dignity rights than they had acknowledged in the whole time up to Roe versus Wade. And so there's an argument that some of these state laws might be challenged based on just privacy grounds, and that they are interfering with people's individual rights to, you know, control over their own bodies and bodily autonomy. I don't think that those are less likely to be successful, but perhaps with some of the more egregious laws that are out there or that will likely go into effect, that you might strike some of those down. You know, other avenues that are available are to wait for a Supreme Court of a different composition. There is the avenue to try to amend the Constitution, which would be a very difficult one. I think that the most likely result then, if Roe gets overturned, is to go back again to that state patchwork where some states allow for abortion and some do not.
Or just to follow up on the abortion thing, I mean, besides the federal law also might not be favorable to abortion. And I can conceive of a Republican-controlled legislature and presidency passing a law prohibiting abortion nationally. Whether Congress would have the constitutional power to do that be a question. But what they might be able to do would be less problematical would be to pass the equivalent of a Mann Act to make it a crime to cross state line to get an abortion, you know, because it's immoral to do that. So the congressional power could cut either way.
You're exactly right. It's not necessarily a guarantee of expanding rights to do that.
In light of the efforts in Congress to get legislation through, so many of those efforts end up with the filibuster threat. And my question is, what do you think that the filibuster should be eliminated entirely, or certain kinds of legislation should be, certain kinds of legislation would be exempt from the filibuster?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, you know, personally, I do think that there, you know, I find it hard to, on this one, to separate kind of my own policy preferences from structurally what I think would be a good idea for the Senate. At least theoretically, I don't think it's a bad idea for there to be additional deliberation over certain topics. However, you know, it's clear, again, that the filibuster is not a tool that's being used judiciously, but being used in kind of a, you know, for lack of a better word, a kind of weaponized form. And I think that part is extremely disturbing, right? That kind of hold up ordinary legislation under the guise of, you know, again, a Senate practice or a Senate rule seems, even if the intent of the filibuster was a good one, and there's a lot of contestation around that principle in the first place, but even assuming that it was a good idea at one point, it certainly was not meant to hold up ordinary legislation on an ongoing basis. So I think that personally, what I'd like to see is maybe a curtailed set of circumstances under which a filibuster would be used. I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't thought through exactly where you would not want to use a filibuster versus use it, and to kind of draw that fine line there. But it certainly seems like the overreach of it at this point, or the overuse of it for political purposes is not, it's not doing what it was intended to do in the first place. And it's certainly making the exercise of legislative power very difficult to manage. So that part, I do think needs to be curtailed. Whether eliminated altogether, I need to think that one through a little bit more.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering how your law students are feeling these days about their future.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that, you know, in the last few years, I think many law schools around the country have seen students who are really excited about engaging in social justice issues and being advocates and activists in a pretty profound way. I know we've seen a lot of that at Western New England. It's been terrific and energizing to see students who want to do this work whether it's kind of addressing unmet legal needs or underserved communities in Western Massachusetts, or kind of taking their skill set and their talents elsewhere after graduation to go make policy elsewhere, right? They are really excited. And I do think that one of the things, perhaps I can use Rebecca's question to kind of bring us back to the start of it, right? That, you know, when you do see the institutions of government and the institutions of democracy being kind of shaken in ways that are really unusual and sometimes shocking, that can be defining and also energizing for people as they're trying to think about what their career paths are going to be or how they want to help navigate the world. And you know, that moment in January of 2017 when you know, executive orders were put into place that prevented immigrants from landing at airports or you know, deplaning at Logan, and you see lawyers running to the airport with their laptops and trying to file emergency petitions, access to clients and whatever else. That's powerful, right? It's powerful to show what it is that people can do. And I also think that, you know, like a lot of professions, the law is not certainly doesn't have a monopoly on this, but this ability to like work with a client and affect someone's life on a really profound basis, right? And really help them and serve them is something that's really meaningful to a lot of students right now. And I think that this moment speaks to the need for even more people to be doing that work out in the world. So we have benefited from that. I think a lot of law schools have benefited from it. And in the next few years, you know, these people will be out in the world practicing law. And I think we're all the better for it, for these folks who are social justice lawyers going to be out in the world.
That's actually very encouraging. Thank you for, well, Sudha, thank you so much. That was just really a wonderful opportunity to kind of pick your brain and hear you talk about these things of which you have a lot of expertise. And it's actually has made me feel a little bit heartened. So I hope that other people have felt heartened and encouraged and energized and ready to do whatever part we can to progress the world in a better direction. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Really, really.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to see everyone and to have this conversation. It was lovely. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much.
Yay, Sudha, thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.